Let's bring in my colleague and fellow eNCA Dan Moyane now, who is, as you know, is a former activist in his own right, but also has covered South African politics for many, many years and knew the late Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu personally. But Dan, thank you for joining me. So just let's start with your own reflections of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. What is the one abiding memory and I suppose legacy for you, the big takeout from the life of the late Desmond Tutu?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon rather, Thulasizwe. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I mean, growing up in Soweto and being in a Christian family, I had the opportunity for me to serve as an altar boy at the St. Paul's Anglican Church in White City, Jabavu. That is the first time I came into contact with the Arch, but then he had just been the bishop of the Anglican Church in Maseru in Lesotho, and just before in the mid-70s, when he became the first black dean of the Anglican Church in Johannesburg. I think that was 1975. So it's around that time. When I think of the Arch and I look back then and later on in years as time went on and one was now living and working in exile in Mozambique, one thing that stands out for me is his energy. I mean, he was this, I mean, by physical stature, I mean, he was a small body, small physical structure, but he stood tall and energetic all the time when he took to the pulpit and he was preaching way back in the 70s. And he really was never fazed by authority. And he stood up even to the likes of the person we call the Groot Crocodile, P.W. Botha, and that was also in the 80s and all the way from the late 70s to the 80s. So for me, he just stood tall all the time, and he was not fazed or afraid of standing up to authority. For me, that's really what stands out about his legacy, because even to the new government of a democratic South Africa, he stood up and spoke out against what he perceived to be wrongdoing.
Yeah, but then just tell me about, you know, as activists in the 70s, particularly around the year 1976, which was a momentous year for your generation, but also for South Africa indeed, in as far as the struggle against apartheid is concerned. I'm just thinking about, you know, June 16, 1976 happens, and the repercussions follow with the, you know, huge onslaught, really, that is unleashed on the youth in this country, and also the swelling of the ranks of the ANC in exile, which is where some of you come in that conversation. Just a few weeks or perhaps a few months after that, the Archbishop writes to the then Prime Minister John Vorster, and I want to read an excerpt as shared by, you know, the Desmond Tutu Foundation, you know, from that letter to John Vorster. It says, quote, "How long can a people, do you think, bear such blatant injustice and suffering? Much of the white community, by and large, with all its prosperity, its privilege, its beautiful homes, its servants, its leisure, is hard-ridden by a fear and a sense of insecurity. And this will continue to be the case until South Africans of all races are free." Just tell me about what the image of Desmond Tutu, his voice, being able to write such a letter to J.B. Vorster at that time, what it meant to you as activists at the time in that bastion of political activism that was Soweto.
You must remember, Thulasizwe, that by 1976, I mean, all the big political parties had been banned for over a decade. You had the rise of Black consciousness movement, and on the ground in Soweto, you had some leaders like the Arch. At the time, he had become the dean of the Anglican Church in Johannesburg, and that's just outside, of course, Soweto. And he was part of leaders at the time in the community, the likes of Dr. Ntato Motlana, who were then forming themselves into leadership to assist post the explosion of Soweto. So we looked to them as the leaders, as young people who would assist us in the fight against Bantu education, in the fight against Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, and in the fight literally for freedom. So he represented for us as a church leader a voice of reason, the one we believed could be listened to and respected. However, you mentioned that letter, and from my recollection, the response from the apartheid government under B.J. Forster at the time was really, as expected, dismissive of the efforts by the Arch at the time, being the Dean of Johannesburg, and as a senior leader in the church. I mean, they didn't take it seriously. I mean, so much so that the police minister at the time, as we know, Jimmy Kruger, as well, they did not respond positive to that at all. But for us, it gave us hope that we had leaders and we had people like Tutu who would stand up and say, are you aware that you have a bigger problem on your hands if you do not resolve the issue of freedom or lack of freedom for the African majority? I mean, a few years later, as more and more people were being killed and more bodies were piling up, I mean, Tutu said something to the effect that he was getting tired, said, we are getting tired of bearing these bodies. When are you going to stop the killing?
Lastly, Braden, I imagine that also in your work as a journalist, you must have interacted with the late Arch on numerous occasions and perhaps in other spaces as well. Just share with me some of your own, recollections of his humanity and his legendary humor.
Well, I've got one moment that sort of comes to mind, and I've been thinking about it this morning, Thulasizwe. In the 90s, when I co-hosted the morning show on Radio 702 with John Robbie, because of the way that he spells his surname, the Arch, the late Arch now, oh my goodness, say the late Arch, it's unbelievable. The way he spells his name is T-U-T-U. Now, you know that that will be, in terms of the anglicization of our names, it will be a soft T. But I had assumed for years, I don't know why, and you're going to laugh at this, I had assumed that it is not a soft T-U-T-U. I had assumed that it's a Tutu, okay, as I'm saying it now, because it's a T-U-T-U, therefore it's like Tutu. So when we got him on air, around the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the first thing I said, can you clarify? Because I had argued with John Robbie to say, no, it's Archbishop Tutu, Archbishop Tutu. So he came on air, and then we asked him, we said, Arch, before we talk about the TRC, can you clarify? Because John Robbie kept on saying, no, it's Tutu, like the anglicization. Then he came on air, and he indulged us. He says, no, my surname Utu, Xhosa meaning ashes, Ututu. So I am Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So I lost that one, and we all burst out laughing on air in the studio. That's the kind of a person he was. I mean, he walked into a room, we just felt his aura, and just respectful and laughing. I mean, even when he used to preach in the 70s in church, as the bodies were piling up, he found moments to make us laugh and chuckle inside the Anglican Church. And I recall as well, way back then, that the first time I sang Nkosi Sikelel' Africa was inside the church. It was led by the Arch. When he would finish a prayer, sometimes he would burst into singing Nkosi Sikelel' Africa. Now, that's the kind of a person he was. Very humble, small in stature in terms of physical body, but he was a global giant.
Yeah, absolutely, without question. So in that spirit then of his well-known sense of humor, Braden, you were an altar boy. What then happened?
It's a long story. It was beautiful serving as an altar boy around the mid-70s in St. Paul's Anglican Church in White City, and he came there a couple of times to preach. And as an altar boy, you serve, either you carry the cross, the symbolic cross, or you light the candles, or you light the incense, and and also you help the priest to serve Holy Communion, So after that, I guess we became all involved in political activism. But he never lost that. I mean, he used he used his faith. He really used his faith and the platform to really preach social justice.
No, I'm just messing with you, Praten. Thank you for sharing your memories with us here. You continue to be of great service to us in this country, and also to us as your colleagues here at eNCA and across the industry of journalism. That's Dan Moyane there joining us and reflecting on the life of the late Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu.